All right, hello History 365. So today we're going to be thinking about changes to infantry tactics as a result of gunpowder. Now, the Middle Ages have not particularly been a high point for infantry tactics. Yes, there have been some infantry tactics, whether it's Anglo-Saxon shield walls or even medieval commanders thinking about where they're going to put crossbowmen or archers or things of that nature. But by and large, infantry tactics compared to both the ancient world and the early modern world are much, much simpler in the Middle Ages. And I would actually suggest that there's sort of two general reasons for this. One has to do with state power in general. At the end of the day, complex infantry tactics are a byproduct of state power. States need either institutions or agents to be able to essentially force so many men to engage in the kind of drill, to achieve the kind of discipline that is necessary to produce infantry tactics. And that includes maintaining facilities where soldiers can parade and practice. It may involve having state agents who can serve as drill masters. And also it involves making connections between common soldiers and the state that allows for some level of either rigorous training or at least sufficient participation that certain habits of drill and discipline can be formed. So you generally need strong states to have well-drilled and disciplined infantry, and by and large, in the Middle Ages, we do not have strong states. Now, the other thing that is lacking, and in some ways this is a corollary of the fact that we don't have particularly strong states, is large infantry armies to begin with. And indeed, weak states tend to have smaller armies, and we certainly see that in the medieval period. Whereas we routinely, during in the ancient world, see armies that consist of 20, 30, even in some instances 50 or 75,000 men. Even big medieval armies for really important campaigns oftentimes comprise no more than 5, 10, 15,000 men. And indeed, one of the main purposes of infantry tactics in the ancient world, when obviously we don't have gunpowder or the complications of gunpowder to deal with, is simply organizing huge masses of men in a way that they don't interfere with one another, and also ensuring that these large masses of men can quickly and efficiently mobilize on the battlefield. That's why you need things like the files and the subunits of a Macedonian phalanx or the maniples and cohorts of a Roman legion. If you're trying to quickly deploy 20,000 men, you need subaltern officers, say centurions, who can organize units quickly and efficiently and deploy them in a kind of predictable manner. So the need to deploy large numbers of troops, I think in some ways explains why we get infantry drill in the ancient world. The fact that we do have, in at least some instances, much stronger states also helps to support that. And then that goes away in the Middle Ages, where we have smaller armies and where the infantry, while it still has a role in the battle, oftentimes is just deployed in a very simple kind of massed formation. And there's not that many infantry to begin with, which means you don't necessarily need more complex forms of drill to actually successfully move them around the battlefield. Now, guns is going to change a lot of those considerations, even as armies are still relatively modest, although they're going to get bigger and bigger as states also start getting stronger and stronger as we enter into the early modern period. But guns change a lot of those calculations. And I think one key factor, and this certainly determines how infantry tactics even work today, for those of you who are in ROTC, guns are direct fire weapons. And that means that if you have a mass of, say, archers or a mass of javelin men, and there are some people in, say, the back of the formation, they can actually, if need be, still influence the battle by shooting their arrow at a higher trajectory, or throwing their javelins above the people to the front of them. Now, in the case of small arms, if you have a sort of disorganized mob or mass of men, only the handful of men in the front can shoot. And this either makes the men in the back combat ineffective because you don't have a disciplined formation, or worse, it raises the possibility of friendly fire. If you have a group of men kind of ambling around and some guy in the back thinks he sees a target and a guy ambles right in front of his line of sight as he pulls the trigger, and it takes time for the match to fall, and it takes time for the gun in the pan to ignite, it takes time for the pan to ignite the main charge, and then boom, and now some guy's walking in front of him and he just shoots him dead. So friendly fire considerations also really increase exponentially once you have firearms. That doesn't mean that there wasn't friendly fire before. Two Athenian contingents at the Battle of Delium in 424 accidentally attack each other with spears and swords. But guns raise the possibility of much more catastrophic friendly fire. So one point of infantry formations is A, to mass the number of guns that you actually have bearing forward. Secondly, to ensure a lack of friendly fire. And third, and I think probably most importantly, and this is something that Andrade deals with in The Gunpowder Age, the book that you're reading, you need to deal with the problem of reloading. And this is going to be dominant for the single-use, single-shot firearms that we'll be dealing with up until the end of this course. You discharge a musket, and at best, even if you're a very good swift loader, you may be looking at 30 to 45 seconds before you can hope to get another shot off. So this leads to sort of two different aspects. One, and this is something that the Gunpowder Age talks about, various kinds of drills that allow for volley fire. So that one musketeer fires, he then moves to a different position, usually falls back several ranks, starts to reload. Once he's reloaded, he moves forward to an intermediate rank, and then in a front rank, the next guy steps up, fires, and this repeats the process. Now, I think as Andrade points out, this type of drill, the fact of having musketeers constantly moving up and back as they fire, reload, and then stand ready to fire, this kind of drill gets reinvented independently in several different places. It exists in China, it exists in Japan, it exists in Korea. The Dutch seem to sort of perfect it. And of course, it had in some ways existed before, that in some ways the crossbow, also being a very direct fire weapon, directly sighted weapon, sort of requires some of the same considerations as muskets, slow to load, and also if you have a sort of massive crossbowman, the guys in the back really can't influence. They can't shoot at an arc in the same way that someone with a standard bow or a longbow can. So it does seem that, say, Sicilian crossbowmen may have approached some of this, and as Andrade points out, Chinese crossbowmen had been doing the same thing at a very early date, coming up with drills that allow for volley fire between ranks that are firing, ranks that are standing ready, and ranks that are reloading. Now, with the earliest guns, the crudest guns, they still take a very long time to reload. Remember, these are matchlock guns. You literally have a burning fuse. In some instances, the guns themselves are quite large. So you have like an arquebus, a hook gun, which literally the gun has to balance on a hook because it's so large. It's essentially you carry around a hook almost as a monopod. So these guns, even if you're arranging some level of volley fire, still are very slow. One key thing has not yet been invented, and that is the socket bayonet. When that comes around, that's going to revolutionize infantry tactics. But without the socket bayonet, when you fire your arquebus or musket, or again, these guns, hand cannon, they go by so many different names until the term musket kind of becomes dominant. When you fire your musket, if the enemy catches you after you have fired your musket, you are now armed with a very unwieldy club. And it does seem from a pretty early point, clubbing a musket, flipping it over and just using it, bashing people with the stock, is a remedy of last resort for gunmen. But that being said, that's a pretty poor use of a musket, and also it's not a particularly optimal weapon. One solution that is hit upon by the 16th century is to combine musketeers armed with muskets with pikemen, and therefore create a kind of hybrid force, in that the pikemen, who fight also in disciplined, well-drilled formations that actually are reminiscent of the old Macedonian Sarissa armed phalanx, they provide a kind of infantry refuge for the musketeers. So if the musketeers are reloading and there's an attack of cavalry or other infantry, the pikemen can defend the musketeers with their very long pikes that give them, in some instances, over 20 feet of standoff. But the musketeers also then support the pikemen in that if they're engaging in their ordinary volley fire, they prevent other cavalry or infantry, or importantly other gunmen, from getting too close to the pike formation. And so this synergy between pikemen and musketeers will become, at least for until really kind of the 30 Years' War, the middle of the 17th century, a sort of key synergy. It's notable that as, again, we have these new types of drill being involved, because now, once you have pikemen and musketeers, commanders have to think very, very carefully about how they're ordering their infantry formations. You need a formation of pikemen. You need to, on the side of each pikeman, you have to have clusters or companies of musketeers. The pikemen and musketeers need to work together in a kind of interlocking system. And this requires much more drill and discipline than you needed even to do something like, create an Anglo-Saxon shield wall. It's not surprising that people at the time therefore take great inspiration from ancient tactics. This is a time when, this is the Renaissance, so there's huge interest in ancient texts, in finding new ancient texts. One big sort of thing that is changing by the 16th century is people in the West are increasingly reading Greek texts and recovering Greek texts, including Polybius and his description of the Roman army. Therefore, as military thinkers are, again, creating new types of infantry formations, they are looking to classical antecedents. Although, again, they never replicate anything perfectly. They actually try. And, of course, they discover that in the age, when we actually have muskets and cannon, what worked exactly for the Romans doesn't necessarily work exactly for the early modern period. But nonetheless, one inspiration that they take, again, it almost combines elements of the Macedonian phalanx and the Roman legion. So the element of the Macedonian phalanx is the idea of dense, well-drilled formations of pikemen. This type of formation, again, had already kind of re-emerged organically. It had redeveloped in Switzerland as Swiss mercenaries start fighting with pikes, and then the pikes get longer, and soon other entities are copying these Swiss pikemen. But people then pretty quick notice, like, oh, this is actually not all that different from the Macedonians under Alexander and the Macedonians who fought the Romans. They also, of course, look to the modular nature of Roman infantry tactics. And so, ironically, what sort of gets, you almost get a kind of Frankenstein's monster in terms of inspiration from ancient tactics, taking blocks of pikemen. The Romans really never used pikemen, but then arranging them in a triplex acies, in a three-line battle line, in sort of big blocks of pikemen arranged in a kind of quincunx formation with with companies of musketeers supporting those pikemen, and then, in some ways taking advantage of it once the sort of standoff distance and the sort of mass and density of a pike formation, and yet also the kind of modularity that a legionary formation, particularly a cohortal formation, because they read Caesar quite a bit, could give. And that certainly did influence, say, what tactics look like. So you have, the idea of a sort of pike complex, which was called a tercio, block of pikemen in the center, companies of musketeers around it. And then people say, well, let's actually start arranging a bunch of tercios together, and then let's create kind of 3 lines of those. And again, it's not exactly a cohortal legion, it's not exactly a Macedonian phalanx, but it blends those 2 elements. The key thing, though, again, is this to form up like this. The musketeers know where they need to stand, how they need to move, how they need to do their volley fire. The pikemen know how they need to stand, how they need to maintain their formation, how they need to maintain their position relative to the musketeers. This requires drill and discipline, and the fact that we start seeing this drill and discipline also suggests that something is happening in the sort of infrastructural capacity of European states to raise, to train, to discipline larger infantry formations. This is going to be part of a trajectory towards much stronger first European and then Western and then global states, which takes us into the present day. So those are just some thoughts on how guns change infantry tactics, at least immediately in the really sort of 16th and 17th centuries, up until the invention of the socket bayonet, which allows for pikemen to become irrelevant. Next time, we'll actually start thinking about how artillery changes European fortifications, in particular, largely ending the era of the medieval castle. So talk soon.